the closed caption reading underneath it as you were talking. You were talking about the purposes which take all of our unique destiny and purposes which take all of our varied talents and foibles mixed together, and it translated the foibles as fables.
Oh,
But also our varied talents and fables mixed together as a, yeah, okay. Yeah, that was cute.
I'm sure one could make a case for that.
Yeah, one could.
Okay. All right, we're at 7 o'clock, but I imagine we'll have somebody else join us. People might still be an hour behind, who knows, right?
Well, the Academy Awards are on,
Oh, we're competing with that.
And yeah, let's
so I'm sure that there's lots of people watching those and glued to it.
Probably best supporting actor now or something like that, right? Who knows? All right, let's get started. Eileen has graciously volunteered to introduce Mark, who will be speaking to us tonight about the dark night of the soul.
Okay,
Not
so
you've ever seen on Seinfeld.
probably not, probably not. I'm not sure if I get to introduce Mark because I, of a large population, am one of the few people who can spell his last name. But it's probably because Mark and I have been coworkers for, is it 7 years or 8 years, Mark? I don't know.
it's going to be 7 years this month.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So we've been coworkers for a while. Mark and I took a group of people on pilgrimage to New Mexico, and that was a wonderful experience. We work at the Franciscan Spiritual Center. Mark was started training as a Franciscan, left that celibacy path to have a wife and children, and then he's been trained in contemplative psychology at Naropa University. At the center, he teaches the meditation classes and runs groups on that. And whenever we have a class at our Franciscan Spiritual Directors Training Program, we call in Mark to do both Dark Night of the Soul and dream work. So he's a fabulous dream worker. I would say that a personal credential that Mark carries is that he has an encyclopedic memory for Monty Python sketches.
Oh, I'm glad to
So-
see people clapping and laughing. I'm with my peeps.
Yes. Okay, I'm done introducing you,
All right.
Mark.
Oh, okay. Oh, there's so much more, but
I
none of
know
it,
there is. I
none
know,
of
but
it,
you
none
know,
of
then
it really relevant. Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well, it's wonderful to be here, and I want to introduce my partner, Karen. On my screen, she's in the upper right-hand corner. And so providing inspiration. And I want to give you, start off by reading my premise for tonight and for the Dark Night of the Soul. And first of all, let me ask, how many of you are familiar with Dark Night of the Soul, either from, a kindergarten level to a doctorate degree level? Just any level of that at all. If you're familiar with it, go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So thank you for that. And I may be calling on those of you who raised your hands because I got to admit I am in no way an expert. I have a level of knowledge of this that is both intuitive and intellectual and heartfelt and personal experience, and have worked with people in spiritual direction who are going through the dark night of the soul. And so I'm relatively familiar with it. I am not one who's going to write a book about it, but I think I can help you out here. So here's my premise. St. John of the Cross became a Carmelite father in 1563. He is credited with coining the phrase dark night of the soul. More than 500 years later, it has become a popular topic in religious and spiritual circles. These days, you hear so many people talking about dark night of the soul in so many different ways. And so it's become a phrase that has been used. And being a dark night of the soul snob, I will sometimes cringe when people use it for things like, my girlfriend just broke up with me. That does not qualify necessarily for dark night of the soul. The experience that John described is more than likely thousands of years old. He was just the first one to coin the phrase as far as we know, but you can bet that some of the things you've been studying with Scott and Eileen, that those people way before John of the Cross were familiar with the experience. They may not have labeled it as Dark Night of the Soul. They may have labeled it something else. But you can bet that those desert mothers and fathers and Francis and Claire were familiar, and Julian and Norwich were all familiar with the experience of Dark Night of the Soul. And let's also keep in mind that people of other spiritual traditions probably have something like Dark Night of the Soul that they're aware of too. They just don't call it that. So, but in describing and naming the experience, John still serves as an instrument of spiritual development by helping people become aware. And be aware that I put become aware in bold letters to help us become aware of this. And I'll be talking more about the awareness on that level. Okay, I'm going to take a view of myself out of here. So, okay, I can't seem to take off the view of myself here.
I can.
Oh, please. There we go. Thank you.
I usually do that because people like to be able to see the speaker as a larger screen,
Oh,
but it's fine. Everyone can set their own speaker view if they choose to, but that you want to be able to see us, so that works.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you very much. That way I know if anybody's sleeping.
Got it.
Okay. Thank you. So yeah, I highlighted become aware because now we've been aware of this phenomena, this spiritual reality for people on the spiritual journey. We've been aware of it for at least over 500 years. It's been a part of our culture, and it doesn't have to be something strange and mysterious. We can grow in our awareness of it. So John is helping us by helping people become aware of an instrumental part of growing in Christ consciousness, otherwise known as putting on the mind of Christ. And what I'm wondering is, one of the things I want to put forth there, I'm not here to give you a bunch of the history of that and the dates and names and those kind of things. Because what I'm concerned with is that what are we going to do with this? What are we going to do with this today in this time of many people are going through personal crises and the entire globe going through a crisis? What are we going to do with that? So what I'm thinking is, what I'm putting forward is perhaps the current desire to know about the dark night of the soul can be seen as a call to update how we respond rather than react. Consider the difference between responding and reacting. You know, like when you respond to your child or grandchild or to somebody who's arguing with you or talking with you rather than reacting. So we can respond to this when it comes up in us. We know that it's something that happens on the spiritual journey. So I'm going to ask Karen to read a poem, and Karen, if you would also say who wrote the poem and a little bit about where she comes from, maybe.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. This is a quote, actually, from Barbara Brown Taylor, and many of you probably know of her. And she's an Episcopal priest, and she's not any longer serving a parish, but she's an author and speaker. And she wrote a book called Learning to Walk in the Dark. And this book is a chronicle of her journey to explore the potency of darkness. And she writes about how we have culturally learned to be afraid of the dark and trying to push away the dark and scramble out of the dark. And she inherited that relationship with darkness as well. So she went on this journey to explore the power of darkness. And this is a quote from her book. Even when light fades and darkness falls, as it does every single day in every single life, God does not turn the world over to some other deity. Even when you cannot see where you are going and no one answers when you call, this is not sufficient proof that you are alone. Darkness is not dark to God. The night is as bright as the day.
Thank you, Karen. And some of what's behind that is the notion that faith is not a matter of proof. Faith is without proof. It's not something that science can go out and prove. Faith is so in the dark night of the soul, one of the ideas is, one of the things in there is that people, I'm going to use air quotes here, people of faith go along and sometimes enter into faith communities because they've had some sort of awareness of something greater. And then in the dark night of the soul, what typically will happen is that sense of God's presence, that sense of God's awareness, of an awareness of God, presence of God, experience of God, goes away. And the question is, can we still believe even though we do not have a visceral experience of the presence of God? And that's what builds faith. And sometimes we have to go through a period of that sense of absence. And notice I said sense of absence. There's no way God can be absent. No way. But we can believe, we can sense, like, oh, it's not the same. I'm not getting that same buzz when God comes on the screen. Okay, I'm getting something to Warren, was that from you? Are you asking that? Yeah, can you say what
Yes, I do not know what the phrase means. I would appreciate some sort of definition because we seem to be talking about it as if everyone knows what it is, and I, for one, don't.
Okay, and yeah, thank you, Warren. And I'm getting into that a little bit in saying that the Dark Knight, and I'm going to get into it more too. So thank you, Warren. So the Dark Knight is referred to. I'm going to read something here then from this book here. Maybe I should do self-view.
Yeah, we've got you.
Okay.
Those of us.
So it's Dark Night of the Soul by Gerald May. And he was a spiritual director or a psychotherapist who and spiritual director who left a psychotherapy practice to become strictly a spiritual director. And here's what he writes in this particular book. And this is the book that I would really recommend that people start with if you're not familiar with this process. He says, the dark night of the soul is not restricted to holy people. It can happen to anyone. I believe that in some ways it happens to everyone. Yet it is much more significant than simple misfortune. It is a deep transformation, a movement toward indescribable freedom and joy. And in truth, it doesn't always have to be unpleasant. The dark night is a profoundly good thing. It is an ongoing spiritual process in which we are liberated from attachments and compulsions and empowered to live and love more freely. Are we getting there for you there, Warren?
Frankly, no.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
You talk about the process without defining the process. So what is a dark night of the soul, please?
Okay.
Mark, I think, would it help to say that some people experience depression as a dark night of the soul? A time when they're wondering, who is God? Where is God? God has abandoned me. So that's what a lot of people experience as the dark night of the soul, that calls into question everything they believe.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Eileen. And then he says the darkness of night implies nothing sinister, only that the liberation takes place in hidden ways, beneath our knowledge and understanding. It happens mysteriously in secret and beyond our conscious control. For that reason, it can become disturbing or even scary, but in the end always works in our benefit. So that's a part of it. And then to reiterate, when we speak of darkness today, we are often referring to something sinister, as in powers of darkness or the dark side. As I've said before, this is not what Teresa and John mean when they use the Spanish word for dark, which is oscura. For them, it simply means obscure. In the same way that things are difficult to see at night, the deepest relationship between God and person is hidden from our conscious awareness. So I hope that helps, Warren. Okay, great. So somebody brought up the difference between dark. Well, let's stop there. And any questions, any other questions at this point? Okay.
It sounds like for many people, maybe for most people, when that kind of depression descends and one senses, that a palpable darkness in your heart, the temptation is to say, there is no God. I was deluded. If one believed in God in the first place, or some power, some dark power is ascendant. And what Gerald May is trying to tell us is that yes, that's a logical conclusion, but in fact, this quite the opposite.
Yes, absolutely. And it can bring us to a true faith if we hang in there. And Eileen knows as a spiritual director that oftentimes when we face this with people, the temptation is because they're so uncomfortable. You know, at one time they had this kind of like love affair with God, and suddenly they're not getting any kind of consolation, and they feel like God has abandoned them. And that may not be the case at all. But what John of the Cross was saying was that this time is important to build real faith, instead of faith based on some sort of felt sense. This is faith based on it gets built up from a lack of there being proof, some sort of proof to the person. And it's kind of like with the story of Job. If you think about the story of Job, you know, he has all these gifts and graces and all this from God, and he has wives and children and cattle and all this stuff, and he never complains against God. And then suddenly, you know, God and Satan make a pact that Satan is going to intervene there and show and prove that Job is not this upright person, that without his stuff, he's not going to be a man of faith, that he'll lose his faith altogether. Well, Scott and Eileen and some of you others there can probably tell me exactly how many chapters it is that Job's buddies come along and try to convince him that he must have done something wrong, that now all of a sudden he's missing all this stuff, you know, losing it. Eileen, you got something there?
It's more than 40 chapters. I think it's 42 chapters. Sorry,
Oh, no.
sorry.
The friends,
42,
no, the friends
that
come
number.
along. The friends come along in the teens, at least, or maybe even earlier than that.
Well, yeah, they come along really early, and each friend gets two whacks at Job, and then a fourth friend comes and takes another whack at Job, and then finally God talks to Job. Job
42
refuses.
chapters later.
Yeah. And God says to Job, "Where were you when I formed blah, blah, blah?" So it's a profound piece. It's really a profound reading. If anyone's interested, I have a liberation theologian's take on it, and you can ask me about it.
Right, thank you. I'm glad you both came in there. That's wonderful. And yeah, so yeah, and the way I kind of paraphrase what happens after God comes in, the Almighty comes in and says, "Where were you when I did all this stuff? Where were you when you put this and that?" And Job winds up in the dust, renting his garments and putting ashes on himself and doing all that stuff. And you know, a paraphrase of what he says is, before I knew you only by hearsay, but now I know you by direct experience. You've all been studying the mystics. That's what we're talking about here. Before I knew you only by hearsay. So that's the religion that says, how does it go? Jesus loves you. Yes, I know, because the Bible tells me so. And that's fine. That's one step along the way. But all of a sudden it's like, I don't know that Jesus loves me. I don't know that God's loves me. I don't feel it anymore. I'm just not feeling it. And then through the dark night of the soul, through the missing of that, it can the person becomes more sensitive and wants this experience and is more open to it and surrenders, comes to a surrender. And then that is oftentimes when the direct experience comes in. That's mysticism, direct experience. The person has gone from becoming call them a believer, a follower, or whatever, and then they become one of the mystics.
Yeah.
And that seems to be, we don't know, of course, we don't know for sure. The mystic is somebody who becomes more and more familiar with mystery.
Yeah.
So that's what's going on, is now all of a sudden we can have this dance, this love affair with mystery. And so then we go into the Song of Songs and all that love stuff about oh, my beloved, where has my beloved gone? And on the search for the beloved, and the mystery of this, how that can appear or disappear. And this is something that's difficult for a society, people who have become caught up in the rational in particular. It doesn't make sense. And so it brings us down more into our bodies, into our hearts, into our guts, and it brings the whole person there. Scott?
I'd even go further and say that what we've been trying to get at in this class, and I'm so glad you've actually said it. This is the first moment we've really gotten to this point, that maybe in the intellectual side is a protection against us actually having God deal with us. It appears to be the case with the desert tradition, where Anthony went out into the desert to get away from the intellectualizing of bishops who were trying to decide somehow how much of a person Jesus was compared to how much of a God he was, as if humans could peel back that mystery. And Julian in Norwich, has this experience at the age of 31 when she sees pretty much Jesus face to face. And it's been speculated that maybe before that she was instructed by friars and was under the spell of an intellectual form of faith as opposed to the real thing. So this is absolutely where we want to go with this whole class. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah. And I think of, Eileen talked about Francis and Clare, and we look at St. Francis' story, and he grew up in the church, of course, and he heard a lot about God and Jesus, and then he goes off to war thinking this is what God wants of the Christians, is to go off and kill Muslims, and that it's a glorious thing, and he experiences anything but the glory eventually, and winds up a prisoner of war, and comes back to Assisi just in total disarray and sick for a long, long time. And then he goes off and wanders off to pray in San Damiano Church, which is down in the valley by itself there, and it's crumbled to the ground. And there's still some stuff remaining there, including a crucifix of Jesus. and he hears a voice from there saying, rebuild my church, which you can see is crumbling around me. So he has this mystical experience, and bam, that's what, that gets him out of his dark night of the soul that he experienced through the war and after the war. And so then he can trust that God will always be with him from that point, even if he loses the felt sense of God. The mystic isn't constantly 24/7 feeling in that midst of God. Sometimes, it comes and goes, it waxes and wanes. And the fact that that happens doesn't mean that, like the poem or the quote that Karen read, darkness, what is it? Let's see, even when this is not sufficient proof that you are alone. Even when nobody answers, when you call, this is not sufficient proof that you are alone. So then, okay, I want to stop there for a little bit and introduce something else on top of this. And any questions or comments at this point?
Well, you've talked about this darkness that is absence. I read The Ascent of Mount Carmel in college. I chanced upon it in the stacks of the library and started reading it one night and was captivated by it because it dwelt for a long time. This is my memory. That was 55 years ago. I remember very little of, I couldn't quote from it or anything like that. But the idea was that, yes, you're in this darkness and there are all sorts of things that won't relieve it. Temptations would be a word for them, but not temptations the way I had ever thought about temptations. And that torturous feeling of darkness does end at the end of the dark night of the soul. I would say that. And yes, you go through periods where it's not clear to you that God is in you or in your life. But it's not that torturous anymore. That would be one sense to me of that you dwell in that for an extended period of time, longer than you ever wanted to. And then it does end.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry. And what that brings to mind is that for us to keep in mind that John of the Cross wrote all this beautiful love poetry about the love with the belover and the beloved, between the soul and God. After he got out of imprisonment by his own Carmelite brothers put him in kind of a prison. What it actually was a dungeon bathroom. He was kept in a dungeon bathroom. Imagine what that must have been like in the 1500s. And every day, his brothers, out of the kindness of their hearts, would whip him. They would take turns whipping him to cleanse him of his sin of trying to reform the Carmelite order with Saint Teresa of Avila. That was his dark night of the soul. He went into that prison as Brother John of the Cross. He went in as John. He came out as Saint John of the Cross. So thank you for bringing that up, Larry.
All right. But it seems to me that not everyone gets through the dark night of the soul.
Hmm.
I have a good Jewish friend who says, think about the Holocaust. There is no God. If there were a God of any sort, there would not have been a Holocaust.
Wow. That's a powerful point, Warren. That's a powerful point. And I can't speak for each and every one who went through that situation. I don't know what point they may have came to. So here again, there's some darkness in that we don't know where those people were in their spirituality and their souls as they came to that. Could it have been like you know, Daniel in the lion's den, or with the fire and that kind of stuff? I don't know what each person individually experienced there. But thank you. Probably a good portion of them, at least, or maybe all of them, didn't come out of their dark night of the soul.
How did John of the Cross come out of it?
Well, he came out, and he and Teresa were able to do some reforming of the Carmelites. And he came out and he was able to write this material. And again, so he didn't write this till he came out of it. And those beautiful lines that he writes about the lover and the beloved soul, we still read them today and are inspired by them today. So
I would ask, in any of this discussion, do people talk about the left brain and right brain?
I haven't heard of that brought in, but it makes a lot of sense, and I wouldn't be surprised. What are you thinking there, Doug?
That the the left brain is our language repository. It looks at reality and fractures it into pieces, into this, into that, which we name. And what I was hearing while you were talking was that getting stuck in your left brain is the dark night of the soul. Because if you get over into your right brain is connected. So the left brain is there to think, and the right brain just experiences everything connected. And yeah, I mean, in some ways, for me, religion is all about getting us out of our left brain and into our right brain. That the ministry of Jesus was simply trying to get us connected, to get back to that feeling of being connected. It's experience. It's not something you think about. It's, we've there have been books about thinking fast and thinking slow. The right brain is fast. It's intuitive. It just bang. Can't explain why, but it's got it. And it's been hard for all of us in this, because the right brain doesn't have language. It has to go on its hand and knees and hold out its hat and ask for the left brain to give it some words. And we say, well, it's just metaphor. It's the right brain will say, it's those words don't work at all. I mean, everything is much more nuanced and ambiguous and whatever. I don't know.
Wonderful. Thank you, Doug. And what this call is reminding me of is the importance of community. I appreciate all of you pitching in here. To flesh this out more, to flesh out this mystery more. So I appreciate everyone's input. And thank you for that. And I'm going to move on a little bit here. I see the time, and one of the things that compounds the individual dark night of the soul, which so many people are going through right now, with, all the things going on our planet, and all the wars and violence and earthquakes and floods and different kinds of weather. What some of the people who talk about dark night of the soul are talking about with that is they're referring to a global dark night. That at this particular time in history, the dark night of the soul is not something that is affecting a number of individuals here and there, but it's affecting us all, and that all the institutions that we grew up with have been breaking down and continue to break down. And can you really, I don't know of any institution, whether it be of education or governments or economics or education or marriage or anything that we refer to as an institution. I can't think of any of them that aren't breaking down in one way or another these days. And so that's some of why they're referring to a global dark night of the soul. So the people that Eileen and I see in spiritual direction right now, oftentimes they're coming in not just with their own loss of faith, of what they call faith, and not knowing where to turn, where to go, what to do. There's also us being surrounded by the churches and, like I said, educational institutions, the family breaking down. They're not what they once were. And, so to the question of, do we always come out of it or not? Well, some people are saying, we're not going to get through this. We're not going to get through this global dark night. It's all falling apart around us, and we can just kiss it goodbye. And others are saying, well, the pattern in life has been things have to break down in order for new things to come up. So what do y'all think about that? What do you think about that pattern? And where do you see with that pattern of things having to break down in order to come back? Maybe you won't say better, but different. I'd like to think it's going to be better, but it's not going to be the same. What do you think?
Internal combustion machines are done with, and we're all going electric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and again, this dark night of the soul can be considered to be the school of learning to dance with mystery, and maybe turning to that other spiritual classic, the cloud of unknowing. Mm-hmm.
The Tao, I've been reading the Tao Te Ching recently, and it's fascinated with this whole movement. Here's from chapter 18 from the Tao. When wisdom and intelligence are born, the great pretense begins. That is, that wisdom and intelligence aren't the last word on anything. When there is no peace within the family, filial piety and devotion arise. When the country is confused and in chaos, loyal ministers appear. That's a hopeful kind of thing, that there is a balance. That to say that everything is going to hell and will never get better is to, I think, take maybe it requires as much belief as is required to be optimistic. How's that?
Yeah. Yeah, and I heard something recently, you bring up optimism, Scott, and that between the middle way between pessimism and optimism is visionary realism.
Hmm.
And in that visionary realism, we can say, yeah, things are really rough right now. And we're not doing an either or. Either everything's going to hell in a handbasket, or everything's going to the highest state of heavenly stuff that we can consider. But the visionary realism says, yeah, it's real tough right now, and it may never be perfect, but it can get better. And the visionary sees, like the biblical prophets, that something better and incredible can come of this, if we don't lose heart.
Right.
I read a couple books by Thomas More, the modern Thomas More, not the saint, several years back, and the thought that always struck with me that I thought was really helpful was that he was doing these exercises with organizations to help them kind of break down the barriers between people and move to a higher plane. But he observed that when you're tearing down what needs to be torn down in order to build something better, that it's impossible to tell while you're doing that whether it's all going to tear down and end up in rubble and nothing, or it's going to be torn down and something better will replace it. So there's like this necessary process of deconstructing that's necessary to build something better, but there's no guarantee that the deconstructing doesn't end up in anything but a pile of rocks.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. And can you see the moment of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane there?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what's going to come of this, but here we go.
Good
Yeah,
luck, General Motors and Ford and Stellantis. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, and I want to turn back to Francis, St. Francis of Assisi. Coming out of his dark night of the soul, and some of what he realized before he went into that was what we might call today, and there's a teacher today his name is Robert Holden, and he suggested a frame, a little switch up of the phrase "dark night of the soul," because the soul is really something different. What he says is that it's actually a dark night of the ego. Now, they didn't have that language of ego back in John of the Cross's day, but the soul kind of relishes darkness. The soul isn't, and I'm not talking about dark as in evil, but the soul relishes working in obscurity. And but it's the ego that starts getting broken down through this dark night. It's my identification, me identifying with the things that help me feel self-important, better than others, and then there's that more negative ego that makes me feel worse than others. I'm the worst sinner on earth, that kind of stuff. So with St. Francis, he used to go up into caves in the mountains, and for hermitage, and he would be there by himself, but he would always take one of the brothers with him to stay outside of the cave and watch over things so that he could have his solitude. And the brothers would report Francis repeating over and over again, Who are you, Lord, and who am I? Who are you, Lord, and who am I? And you can hear that as him realizing that who he was clinging to, his image that he was clinging to was breaking down. Who am I and who are you? And there's nothing in the writings that would indicate that he ever came to a final conclusion on either one, on either who are you, Lord? Who am I, Lord? Never came to a conclusion, left it wide open. And that's the dancing with mystery. He built up a tolerance for mystery so great that he didn't have to come to a final conclusion on either one of those. And
it also seems to me that when the ego breaks down, that's as Richard Rohr would say, the false self breaking down, that the dark night is necessary for us to purge ourselves of our false self, the inflated, ego-driven self that builds its castles on things that will not persist or endure. And what you made new to me was the idea that not only does our ego break down, but our false notions of God as well break down there, which is equally important, right?
absolutely.
Which
Yeah.
is also terrifying, right? It's yeah. If we make God in our own image, God is often our best buddy. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Anyone else want to chime in on that? The dark night of the ego? Process there? Larry?
I think we revisit that. It may not be as difficult later, but it's something that like you said, it's not finished. And so you have to revisit that struggle from time to time. That's my sense of it, that you don't have this thunderclap and everything's beautiful for the rest of your life. Something's beautiful, but it's qualified at times.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else who we haven't heard from yet? Karen, Christine, Kathleen, Amy?
Well, I think when I'm in a place of dark night, what gets me through it is, first of all, surrendering to the dark night and allowing myself to be there and to be in it, and realize that it's a crucial part of my spiritual journey. And without it, I may not get to where I'm going to and who I'm becoming. And when I remember that it's an integral, intimate part of my becoming, then I'm able to, that helps me move out of it. Eventually, when I remember the bigger picture, the bigger journey that I'm about, helps me remember that, to be able to then move out of it. And it's the same for me with the global dark night. What helps me is, when I'm feeling really in a dark place around what's happening globally, which is often, I will feel that, it's important for me to be with that suffering for a while. And then I'm able to move through it by remembering that it's a part of a greater turning, a greater evolution as human beings. And where perhaps our souls are driving the bus rather than our egos. Not that the egos are bad, they get us through day to day. It's a part of the human experience, but they shouldn't be driving the bus. And so, yeah, so I think that allowing myself to surrender to the suffering and then also making space for the big picture. What's the journey, the fuller journey that's going on?
Thank you.
And I think I'll just add to that real quickly that two things that I mean, I've been thinking about a lot of things when everyone's been talking, but I think, you know, there's an individual journey and then there's a collective journey of the culture that you're talking about. Because I know, gosh, 10 years ago, I had friends that were all into, you know, we're evolving as a species and our enlightenment is coming as this kind of species-centric thing. And I'm sure you're familiar with those sorts of belief systems. And then there's, you know, your own individual journey. And then when you talk about things like, you know, the great suffering in Gaza or in the Holocaust or any of those situations where there are just so many innocent people just caught into, you know, a terrible situation. I'm not sure that the personal spiritual journey mindset really applies to that. It's like it applies to some things at some point in time. I guess the question I'd have for you is just how much preparation, spiritual preparation, do you think people have to have before they would experience this? Like, do you have to have a sense of connection, which is kind of what you were describing, is you have this sense of connection and then you have this profound grief of abandonment or that you've lost the connection. So maybe, I don't know. Those are just some random thoughts that I had, but a very good presentation, very thought-provoking.
Thank you, Kathleen. And to your question, the experts on this, again, I'm not an expert, but I've done some studying on it and have gone through it. What they say is that some say that somebody has to have a spiritual life, you know, a conscious spiritual life. You know, before the dark night of the soul. And I can say for myself that before I had my own faith, you know, I grew up Catholic and I went to the Catholic Church. I can't say that I had the type of faith. I didn't have an adult faith. I didn't have my own faith. I went because that's what my parents wanted me to do, you know, and took that on. And then I went through a period of a lot of suffering and you know, almost met a tragic end to my life very early out of that. And right after that happened, I had some mystical experiences like Job, that all of a sudden I had my faith. Now, you know, then that happened. I went, you know, I went sky high with it. It was like, wow, this is so cool, so cool. Well, what goes up must come down. And sure enough, eventually at some point, I went into a deep darkness and that would then be able to be called a dark night of the soul, or a dark night of the ego, if you want to call it that. So that's what some say. Others say that's not necessarily the case. Yeah, and it's not necessarily just one dark night of the soul. It can be more than that.
Yeah.
Dan?
One pastor who had a lot of influence on me when I was in my 20s was he did a lot of pastoral counseling, and he used his pastoral counseling experience a lot in his preaching, and it was very effective. And one of the things he said was, you know, people come to me and they want my help because they want me, there's bad things happening to them and they want me to help them not feel so bad. And he said, what I tell them is if you're going through a period where bad things are happening to you, embrace that and feel bad, because you're going through a bad time. You need to feel bad. You need to find the bottom before you can go up. And so what so many people want is to numb that and to not have the dark night of the soul. They want to have a, you know, kind of a gray night of the soul, but not, you know, not go all the way down. He said, but you know, when bad stuff happens, embrace it and feel bad. And then when good stuff happens, embrace that and feel good. And that was, I thought, really helpful to me. And that was, you know, relevant to what I said earlier about, you know, when things are falling apart, you know, you don't know if they're going to come back together, but you don't know where the bottom is. But,
Yeah.
You know, it's down there somewhere. And, you know, embrace that, find the bottom, and then go up and enjoy the ride up.
Yeah. Dan, you know, that's John of the Cross said pretty much the same thing. He was really ticked off at spiritual directors who would try to artificially get their directees out of the dark night of the soul prematurely. So it's like that opening up a flower bud before it flowers on its own. And I have a quote here from a guy named Frank Ostaseski. He works with the dying, and he says, our avoidance instinct is due to the fact that our culture has decided that suffering has no value.
Mark, you mentioned that the soul likes to work in obscurity. Can you talk a little bit more about that and its relationship to the ego?
Yeah, well, I'm being a little bit Jungian here on that, Carl Jung, and so in Jungian language, he makes a distinction between the spirit and the soul. And he says the spirit is that which wants to soar and go into the light. It loves that soaring and going into the light. And the soul loves the richness of the womb, of the darkness, of the dark depths of the waters, and that kind of stuff. That's where the soul really flourishes. So that bringing together of spirit and soul in Jungian language is some of what we try to do as we embrace a spiritual path and get into it, that we're willing to go deep and into the dark, into our pains and into the suffering of the world, and the tears and that, and also rejoice in ecstatic wonder at the gorgeousness of what we live in, and the beauty of the love that people give every day. So that's how I would respond to it.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yeah.
One thing that's maybe a little bit off the track, but I noticed that Julian and St. John of the Cross and others have an experience that's outside of the norm. And then they spend a lot of time looking at it, describing it, trying to understand it for others and for themselves. And so it brings home to me the necessity of looking at what each of us goes through, each of us looking at it and saying, how do I talk about that? What was happening? And I don't know that everybody has a dark night of the soul. Maybe everybody on the planet does. But we do all have a spiritual life.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. And what I would say in closing, before we get to, Karen's going to read a Barbara Brown Taylor poem for closing. But what I would get into there, and here's part of my premise, is that we have known about Dark Night of the Soul, like I said, at least for 500 years, maybe for way longer than that. And so, since we've known it for so long, why can't we help prepare younger people and ourselves and younger people for it, and just say, this is something that if you start a spiritual life, you will probably run into the dark night of the soul. So it's a good idea for you to take up contemplative practices and be prepared for it. That doesn't mean it's going to get rid of it. Your spiritual practices are not going to rescue or save you, at least from the experience of this dark night of the ego. I'll call it that this time, the dark night of the ego. It's not going to keep you from that, but we can be prepared. And so that's what contemplative practice seems to be about. It's something that we can do to be prepared so that we can glean the most that we can from our experiences of both darkness and light.
Right.
Mark, you mentioned Jung and Jungian philosophy and the Dark Night. Holocaust was mentioned earlier tonight. Did Frankl discuss Dark Night, or did he have that in his vocabulary?
I didn't see that in his vocabulary. It's been a long time since I read Man's Search for Meaning. But one thing I do know is that Elie Wiesel, he wrote the book Dark, and he was in the prison camps and there as a young boy. Towards the end of his life, even after he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he said one thing he just can't do is forgive the Nazis for what they did. That stayed with him. So I don't know exactly why I brought that up, but that's what came up for me in your questioning there is, there again is the mystery. I don't know.
Thank you.
That's interesting, though, that you look at Elie Wiesel and Viktor Frankl, they're almost two sides of the same coin, but very different. Viktor Frankl was a born optimist. I mean, he walked into Auschwitz carrying his PhD dissertation, somehow hoping he was going to come through, that with his dissertation intact. And he did. I mean, he actually did, because he survived it, and he's extraordinary in that way. Elie Wiesel has a very different take on it all. But I loved Kent's question. I'd love to have dinner with the two of them and have Kent's question be asked. It would be so enriching.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's have Karen's final question.
Yeah, I just want to show you one more
Oh.
thing before Karen reads that. The interpretation of Dark Night of the Soul that I would recommend for these days is this one. It's by Mirabai Starr, and I know she's a contemporary. She did this interpretation not too long ago, and she's one of the superstars of the spiritual teaching circuit these days. And one of the reasons why I like it is because previous to this, all of the interpretations have been by men. That's not a bad thing, but Mirabai Starr is not a man. And she's wasn't raised Christian either. She has explored various pathways of spirituality, and that in itself brings a richness to this book that the other books don't have. And that's not to put down those books, but this is really well done. So with that, Karen?
Okay, thank you, Mark. So I appreciate where this conversation has gone here towards the end. And Dan, you got us started with talking about your former pastor. encouraging us to be where we are in the moment, you know, be in the suffering. And, you know, it's the old adage, the only way out is through. And so we never really get out of it if we're not really in it to begin with. So I think those were some wise words. And Barbara Brown Taylor also shares in that. And she says, if we, well, she doesn't say this, I'm saying this, if after reading her, if we befriend the darkness, we can be gifted by the darkness. If we befriend the darkness, we can be gifted by the darkness. And here are Barbara Brown Taylor's words from her book that express just that. When, despite all my best efforts, the lights have gone off in my life, literally or figuratively, take your pick, plunging me into the kind of darkness that turns my knees to water. Nevertheless, I have not died. The monsters have not dragged me out of bed and taken me back to their lair. The witches have not turned me into a bat. Instead, I have learned things in the dark that I could never have learned in the light. Things that saved my life over and over again. So that there is really only one logical conclusion. I need darkness as much as I need light.
That's fabulous. What a perfect ending. I want to thank you, Mark, for giving us the view from 35,000 feet, and for Karen coming alongside. I want to thank Doug Searles for giving us three places, three bits of bibliography in the chat section. Didn't ask him to do that. He volunteered it, and that's so helpful. So thank you all very much. I think for me, I'm seeing some things I have not seen at all before about this, and that's very enriching. So I look forward to the next chapter. Next week, we're going to look at something entirely different. We're going to look at Therese of Lisieux, who was a very young Carmelite nun at the age of 16, who died at 24, but who comes along with a spirit that I think is very in tune with the spirit of the desert tradition, which is to say, you know, if spirituality is only for saints and spiritual athletes, what good is it? She has this huge heart as big as the world. And she says, no, there has to be a little way that we can all be mystics. And you know, made a huge difference in a very short life. So we'll be looking at that next week, and the week after, we'll look at Thomas Merton, who continues to be in print and selling millions of books all the time, which is pretty extraordinary for someone who came of age in the World War II. So blessings on all. See you next time.
You all.
Thank you for doing this instead of the Oscars.
And
Thank
you're
you,
gonna stay
Mark.
for just a
Thank you,
minute,
Karen.
Scott, right?
What's that?
You'll stay for just a minute to talk to
I'll
me.
stay with you and we'll figure out some technical issues, right? All righty.
Okay,
Blessings
good.
on
Thank
all.
you, Mark and Karen. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Eileen, for introducing too.
Yes, thank you very much.
I get
Bye-bye.
to. Bye.
Bye-bye.